I'm so tired.
Yeah, you're another one of those guys that stays up late. Well, let me give you a little advice. Now, listen to what I got to say. Now, here's the way Mother Nature laid out your 24 hours for you each day. She give you 8 for loving and 8 for working, and the other 8 was for hitting the hay.
Hey everyone. We are in week 7 of this semester. Coming off the heels of the first exam. I hope you're all well recovered from that. And it's been a while since I've sat here in the old recording chair for this class. Last time I had material for you guys was in week 4. So it's been a bit. We're going to dive this week into the Enlightenment. So as it says here, you want to have read chapter 16, Toward a New Worldview, from your textbook. Now, this particular chapter in your textbook goes back in time a little bit and then catches up with the time period that we're going to be talking about in class today. So there's actually some material that I've already covered that's in this chapter. You're going to get things, you're going to get some information about Galileo and Newton, things of that nature, because it goes back to like the late 1500s, works its way very quickly through the 1600s and then into the Enlightenment. And I considered just asking you to read the portions that deal with what we're talking about today, but it's actually not a bad idea to sort of get a grounding in what led us to this point as a review, if nothing else, since it has been a bit since we talked about some of those things. Let's go ahead and let's dive right in. We're going to talk about the Enlightenment, sometimes referred to as the Age of Reason. Sometimes the two are sort of considered two separate ways of thinking. I'm sort of combining it all together here. This is this period of time that's going to take place mainly in the 18th century, so we're talking about the 1700s, in Europe, and this would be sort of imported over into what would eventually become the United States, the English colonies over here. Well, we're going to define it much more in depth here in a moment. And we'll talk about two art styles that developed during this period of time, the Enlightenment, during the Enlightenment, rather, the Rococo and Neoclassicism. These are two art styles that arrived during this period of time. Now, forgive me, I'll be looking over this way some. I try to put my camera in a spot where I can kind of... I'm trying not to not look at you as I'm lecturing, but my notes are over here. And I'm trying. So forgive me if I'm not always looking directly into the camera. All right, so the Enlightenment. It's considered the beginning of the modern era in Western history. Now, I don't mean, because we're going to define modern as very much sort of a 20th century kind of thing a little bit later when we talk about modern art. But as far as the modern era, right, the Age of Enlightenment is this particular moment. It's this moment in Western history when a huge break from religious control is going to happen. And things are going to start changing at a much more rapid pace than they ever have before. It was sparked in the 1700s by philosophers and scientists who believed in the power of reason, research, and experimenting in order to learn or make decisions. Right, as opposed to this has been building up in the 1600s as well. Right. You recall Galileo back in the 1600s, who was using observation, coming up with hypotheses to explain the things that he was observing. Right? But in the 1700s, this really takes off. As I say, we get these philosophers and scientists who are breaking away from the pure explanation of, well, that's how God made it. Things are that way because God did it. Right? That's all you need to know. God is the one who put it all into motion. These people are going to say, well, yeah, okay, all right, sure, but how? Like, how does it all work? Like, what's happening within it, right? Is there anything that we can observe? Are there things we can predict? And from the stuff that we discover when we sort of observe and research the universe, what decisions can we make about our place in it, right? So they start diving into science, logic, reason, and common sense, quote unquote. Right? This is a period where educating one's self starts to be held to a high standard. Let's continue on. So there are this is sort of split into two groups. There are the philosophs, who I think Professor McIntosh is going to dive into a little bit. But this group, they were sort of like the social influencers of their day. They were the ones who were taking all this new research, experimentation, and things of that nature, and applying it to our social institutions. Right? They were the ones who were thinking about how we should apply those things to running a society. Right? Then you have the physiocrats, and these are the ones who are the economic influencers. Right? They're the ones who are going to take all of this new research and experimentation and start applying that to economic ideology, so that we arrive at things like capitalism. Communism is going to come a bit later, but it's kind of in the same realm of time. But in each case, what was believed at least to be happening was let's reason, right? Let's think about what kind of systems can be put in place that once human beings are sort of allowed to operate within it, a stable economic system will result from that, right? As opposed to just a feudalist system of economy, or just the economy of the aristocrats, let's say, things of that nature. People started questioning stuff at this time. As a result of the excavations of Herculaneum and Pompeii in 1738 and 1748, respectively, there was this renewed interest in ancient Greece and Rome around about this time. Ancient Greece and Rome at the time were elevated by intellectuals to the height of morality. It's a weird way of thinking about it, but it's what happened. So again, like I mentioned before, science, logic, common sense were pursued by the people of this period. Well, I should say the wealthy of this period. Understand a lot of what we're talking about those who were the wealthy elite or the educated elite who are pursuing this. Right? The poor and the marginalized of society were often left out of the Enlightenment way of thinking. And it was, because one needed to be wealthy enough to be involved in these things. But there's this interesting thing that happens where there are these two sides that start to think about the nature of God. There's deism and pietism. Deism is the ideology that there is a God, but that God is pure reason. The thinkers of the time surmise that we human beings, which seem to be the closest to a godlike being on this planet, are set apart from the rest of the planet, the animals, the trees, what have you, by our ability to reason and think and understand the world around us as we observe it. So they surmise that if there is a God, that God must be pure reason. Pure reason. And that God put the universe in working order, right? That God created the world based on nice scientific and mathematic rules, cranked the key, set it all in motion, and then sat back and had no further involvement in it. For those of you in the audience who are from the United States, many of the people who worked on the Declaration of Independence and a lot of its ideology, as well as the Constitution, were deists. It was part of what was behind the whole idea of God having created us all equal, because if God's just pure reason, there's no reason why any of these human beings, all of whom can reason, that any of them should be above anyone else. Granted, yes, I know there's so many more problematic things sort of built into the thinking and systems of the United States, but let's understand at least the spirit of what was being put into place with the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. Right? And since that God was pure reason and had put everything in motion and then had stood back and sort of said, all right, everybody, do your thing, then it made sense for a society and a government to be ruled by people making decisions for themselves and not by someone who claims to be in touch with some sort of all-powerful God, who is then just passing down the rules that all-powerful God has passed down to them. That the people who are capable of reasoning for themselves should confer, vote, and then that's how decisions should be made. That's the deist way of thinking. Pietism happens in what's called the First Great Awakening. Again, we're talking about in the United States, where suddenly there's this kind of a push in almost the opposite direction. There's kind of a the First Great Awakening, as it's referred to, is also sometimes called the First Great Revival. It's this religious revival that happens in the United States and in some European countries as well, as there are many groups who start to look at even the established Protestant sects of Christianity and start to wonder if they don't even quite have what was intended by Christ and biblical teachings. And out of this, you get things like the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, in that they want to break away from some of the hardline theology, that they felt that Calvinism and Lutheranism and other Protestant groups were still hanging on to. Then this was an era where in the European continent, man, I am sorry for all this stumbling and stammering and bleh. Perhaps 2 weeks is too long for me to not lecture in this class. The European continent is starting to be divided into independent states, and nationalism as a result becomes a big deal. The aristocracy, particularly in France and a bit in Europe, start to regain some prominence, right? With some of the ideas that we were talking about and as Europe was sort of considering how government and authority should be decided, the aristocracy had lost a bit of its power, so it starts to regain some power, and it's the aristocracy that really starts to push the Enlightenment as well. But at the same time, there's this growing middle class, right? There's a growing class of people who are not the poorest of the poor. They're certainly not rich enough to be in the aristocracy or the nobility or anything like that. But there's this growing group who are well off. They're doing okay for themselves. And they're going to become a group that needs to be contended with. And it became the era of many political revolutions that changed the Western world. We'll dive into those much more in depth in our next lecture. But think about the American and French revolutions that happened during this time. And there were two prevailing artistic styles that gained patronage during this time: the Rococo and Neoclassicism. All right. So as I said, we're getting into the 18th century, the 1700s, and if we look at the continent of Europe at this time, we start to see it looking a lot more like it looks now, right? Borders are starting to shore up into something recognizable to us when we look at the map now. There's still a few vestiges, right? Italy is still broken up into a number of the city-states, right? It hasn't quite unified yet. There's still a tiny little vestige of the Holy Roman Empire remaining. There's not much left, and it's really only the Roman and only the Empire in name. This eventually will be Germany. The Habsburg Austrian Empire is beginning to make its ways in. The Ottoman Empire is still hanging on, right? This has been here since the 1400s, so it's still hanging in there. It wouldn't be split up for a while. And you see, it had Greece in its clutches, if you will. Spain and Portugal pretty much look like they do now. France pretty much looks like it does now. Great Britain, the Scandinavian countries, they're all pretty well shored up, right? And so this particular period of time, then, there starts to be a certain amount of national pride. Not necessarily just civic pride, but national pride. And nationalism starts to become a rising influence during this time as well. Now, that's a term we hear bandied about like crazy now, right? Those who criticize it say that the world over the centuries has become a much smaller place, and that our concerns all across the globe are more universal now than in the past. And so nationalism, right, the tendency to want to look after one's own first and consider one's own nation to be the best nation, that is actually detrimental. And then those who would be on the opposite end and would say, no, we need a return to nationalism, would say that globalism has, say, led to the countries that are wealthier having to reallocate what they've worked so hard for to other countries that would be seen as less productive. Right? Now, I'm not trying to tell you where you should land on those two. I certainly have my feelings, but I'm not getting into those. The point is, the idea of nationalism and looking inward toward the nation in which we live and seeing it as a great nation, better than all the others, and also capable of improvement, but that improvement should happen from within. That idea comes up during this particular moment in time, right? And there's this strong sense of nationalism that comes out of this, right? Just understand that this is the time period in which that really takes off and begins. Now, as I mentioned, as it says here, on August 24th, 79 CE. So we're talking only 79, 80 years after the birth of Christ. There was an eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which is up here, that's this bit here, that it was such a huge eruption and was so unexpected that it took out several of the nearby cities, covering them in ash and or lava. Pompeii, right here, and Herculaneum, as I mentioned a moment ago, were discovered and excavated during this period of time, in like the 1730s, 1740s. And so suddenly there were these very well preserved Roman cities that were found buried beneath the ground, right? Most of the Roman cities that were, that were still hanging around at this time, right? Like there's still ancient ruins in Rome. There are ancient ruins throughout Europe from the Roman period of time. But by the 1700s, just as they are now, they were indeed ruins. They were falling apart. They didn't look anywhere near like what they had looked like when they were occupied and populated. Herculaneum and Pompeii looked very they'd just been preserved, right? Because all that ash came down and everything underneath it stayed preserved. And so some of the architecture could be seen for the first time. Some of the artwork could be seen for the first time, because what you see here are both mosaics, and there were plenty of mosaics throughout Europe from the Roman time period, but they were, they were dealing with wear and tear and exposure to the elements and things of that nature. Here, they got to see some of these old mosaics that did a couple of things. One, they got to see some of the vibrant colors of these things for the first time, but also got to see a little bit of how life during the time of the Romans was led. And the artists got to see a little bit stylistically what they were doing with their work. And look, we know that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans painted, right? But those paintings did not survive. We have extremely few paintings from the Roman era. Suddenly in Herculaneum and Pompeii, we had paintings that were done during the time. And so we can see how the Romans chose to paint as well. This got artists of the time interested. All right, now, I say all that, and we're going to kind of break away from it a little bit here, because there's an art style here that is not particularly connected to what the Romans were up to, right? It was the art of the aristocracy, what is referred to as Rococo. It's a Rococo, or what is sometimes also referred to as late Baroque, though it is very distinguishable from the Baroque art that we have looked at. It gets its name, Rococo, from the word rocaille, which means a pebble. And I may have butchered that French there. But
rocaille or rocaille.
It's a French word for a pebble. It refers to the small stones and shells that were used to decorate grotto interiors of the time. It began in the 18th century, the 1700s, in Paris, and was a reaction against Baroque ideology. As I've said, this is going to kind of be the rinse and repeat way that we see art develop in Western Western society. Is one group looking at the generation that came before them and either rejecting it or wanting to add to it, and then making this new thing that everybody's excited about, and then a new generation comes along after them and sees their stuff and decides to reject it, right? So the Baroque had been this rejection against the high Renaissance and Mannerist art of the late Renaissance. And then you get to the Rococo, and the Rococo is looking at the stuff from the Baroque, and they start rejecting some of it. So some characteristics of Rococo art. It is jovial, elaborate, and graceful. And that wouldn't describe any of, at least, the Baroque painting that we looked at, right? It's also going to be highly ornate. I mean, look at this painting over here. Look at just like all of that, all of the fauna. Flora. That's just covering everything. Leaves, branches, twigs, light shining through, right? All of that, just highly, highly ornate. That you're going to see often very creamy pastel-like colors. You can see how that would be a rejection of much of what we saw in the Baroque. Now, they're going to hang on to the Baroque love of asymmetrical designs, right? Getting away from all of that mathematical order of the Renaissance, specifically the High Renaissance. And instead, looking at designs that sort of push everything that we're looking at sort of to one side or another, or up or down, right? They like their compositions to have a little less order to them. Very similar to Rubens, who we looked at in our last lecture. And again, this is also something that they'll take from the Baroque, though we didn't look at a ton of this. They're going to take it to extremes. They like curves and gold trim. Now, I always struggle when we get to the Rococo, because I am not a fan of this stuff. It's for reasons that we'll get into as we go along. But I struggle because, as you'll see as we get to it as well, at the time that it existed, it was also criticized. But it was criticized for reasons that are irksome, as you'll see. They're very problematic criticisms that are lobbed at Rococo. And so I struggle because I look at this stuff and I struggle with it. I don't like it, and I've got my reasons for it that I'll get into as we dive in. And then I find myself wanting to defend it when I read the criticisms of it at the time. So I try as much as possible when talking about the artwork of the times that we look at to not let my personal feelings come out. They certainly came out during Baroque. And I'm going to try my damnedest not to let it come out at least too much during the Rococo. Please, please, please do not allow my displeasure at the Rococo affect you. If you enjoy this stuff, enjoy it. I really and truly do mean that. I will never say to any other human being that they should or should not like something that they like. But I have my reasons that we'll dive into as we go. All right, so Rococo paintings often portrayed secular themes of the French aristocracy engaged in frivolity and highly decorative, angelic scenes of putti. We'll talk about what that means in a moment, and mythical figures. All right, anyway, putti. What is that word? Putti, I know it's so fun to say too, is the plural for puto. And a puto is a little chubby baby cherub angel, right? You've seen them in all kinds of paintings. A couple hundred years before what we're looking at here, you would have had Raphael in the Renaissance, including lots of little chubby, pinchable baby angels. Right? The Rococo loves that kind of thing. All right, so now here is where I struggle with Rococo, because the paintings, as it says right here, are the secular subject matter is the French aristocracy just engaging in frivolity, right? Frivolity. And I think of whenever I read it, I hear Um, I hear Professor McGonagall's voice saying, frivolity! Right? Because that's what it is. I mean, look at the painting that's over here, right? This painting that we see here is a young aristocratic woman who has been left unattended by the women who were supposed to be her chaperones. The gossipy, chatty Cathys who are in here, it looks like they're playing like a card game or something and gossiping. They've left this poor young lady on her own while she was sort of doing her sewing in here. And oh my goodness, little sneaky young man has snuck into the chamber and has come in to steal a kiss from her. And she's looking back at the ladies. Oh, she knows she's trying to stay out of trouble. Oh, this little scamp. Oh, and then that grip he has on her wrist suggests that he might just pull her on out there, right? And it's those kind of thematic things that bug me. All right, so I that's where I'm coming from. The criticisms that were hurled at it at the time, we'll get to in a moment. All right, so it was the subject matter that I'm just talking about was very counter to the ideals of the French academic art of the time, who labeled it as amateur art. Well, we'll get into that. Because the next things we'll say is it was also another criticism that was thrown at it. It was that it was the feminization of art, because most or many of the Rococo artists and patrons were women. In the French aristocracy, at least, women were starting to gain some power. We'll look at that in a moment. A lot of this work, a lot of the Rococo work, was commissioned by women. It was displayed in the spaces that women controlled. Many of the artists themselves were women. And the academic art scene of the time decided to set itself up as anti-this, as we'll see when we get to the neoclassicism. There's also a new sort of exhibition space, because most Rococo painting, sculpture, and interior design were exhibited in ladies' boudoirs, sitting rooms, and romantic love nests. All right, I put that in quotation marks. All right, so the French aristocracy, to understand all of this, you have to understand they had some really loosey-goosey ideas about monogamy. Because men and women were often, in the aristocracy, were often married not for love, but as political and economic alliances, right? And so it was not only unheard of, but was expected that a husband would have a number of lovers, and that a wife would also have a number of lovers. In fact, an aristocratic male or husband, let's say, an aristocratic husband, in building his house, was going to make sure to have an additional portion sectioned off as the love nest. And the love nest would be the place where the lady of the house would entertain her lovers. Now, that to us might sound crazy. It sounds like, oh my God, why would that man demoralize himself like that by building a room in his own house where his wife could be having lovers come and visit her? But understand that aristocratic husband was going off to other husbands' houses, to their wives' love nests, right? There were very loosey-goosey ideas about monogamy. And for the briefest moment, sexuality as well. It might have been hidden away, but it was pretty well acknowledged that sex was not always just between men and women in the aristocracy. Right? So the women then of this time period, who are becoming more powerful, especially in the realms that they have control over, start attaining art, and where are they going to showcase it? Right? Most of the house is not theirs to showcase the work. So the work starts popping up in their boudoirs, their sitting rooms, and in these love nests. And so that becomes a way, again, for the academic art scene of the time in France to point at this work and say, it's just amateur stuff. Right? That's not real art. That's some crap that ladies are using to decorate their bedrooms. Right? That's the kind of criticisms that were hurled at it at the time. So a few artists working in this period. We have Jean Antoine Watteau, or who would often just be referred to as Antoine Watteau. He was an 18th century French painter who was, highly influenced by Rubens, an early innovator of the Baroque. He is arriving at the beginnings of it. You see, he died in 1721, so he's really early. And he's going to take Baroque influences, particularly from Rubens. He's a huge fan of Rubens. He's going to infuse into that his new interests in color, particularly pastel colors, and use those visual languages to tell or to create scenes of bucolic and idyllic charm with a certain theatrical flair, right? He's going to be borrowing some of that from the Baroque as well. And let me see if I can move myself. And he's also representative of a lot of the things that bug me about the Rococo. All right, so this is one of his most famous paintings, Pilgrimage to Cythera from 1717. And it has all of the characteristics we were just talking about. It is highly ornate. Look at all the beautiful scenery and the mist-covered distant hills, all of the trees and their sort of all this beautiful landscape that we're in. We even have some putti, right? These little cute baby angels that have arrived. We have the aristocracy who are here, who are engaging in frivolity, right? Although there's this term, right? The title of it is A Pilgrimage to Cythera, right? Which makes it sound like this group that we have seen here has embarked on a great mission and have finally arrived at their destination, where and their destiny has been fulfilled, this pilgrimage that they've come to, right? And all of the people are arriving on what appears to be an island. And we have, again, all of the scenery, this beautiful, gorgeous scenery that's surrounding us. We also have Greek goddesses that have arrived on the scene, right? These statues of them. We have these putti and other angels, right? We have angels, other gods, right? Greek and Roman gods who are steering the boat that has brought everyone to this island. And it all seems so magical and so important. Such a big thing must be happening here. And it's a picnic. It's the aristocracy showing up for a picnic. They've just come to this island to get together, hang out, eat some food, and mac on the ladies. Look at the scene that is closest to us. The scene that is closest to us. We have this dude right here, right? We have a story that is unfolding in front of us. There's this dude right here who clearly wants to get with the hottie right here, right? He is all up in her personal space. Who knows what kind of sweet nothings are being whispered into her ear, rather. But it's the 1700s. A woman who is unmarried still needs to have chaperones, right? She needs to have women who are older than herself, who are there to protect her chastity, right? They are there to watch over and keep the men away from her, things of that nature. So this guy right here, he thought about that. He thought about that before coming to this picnic, and he has himself 2 wingmen. He has his 2 wingmen who are absconding with this young lady's chaperones. This one, we get the feeling both were seated on the ground at some point. This one is only just beginning to stand up. This gentleman's about to take her away somewhere. This gentleman has already gotten his lady off the ground, and they're about to head off into the distance, who knows where. And she's even got a moment where she's looking back, like, she's looking back at her, like, is this okay? I should probably stay here, but I don't know. I mean, dude's kind of hot, and he has had a lot of cool things he's had to say to me. Yeah, okay, fine, I'm going to go with him, right? And that's what this is about. Like the scene is about that kind of stuff, and that's a theme that we'll find in a lot of Rococo art as well. Sexuality, things of that nature. And given where the work would have been placed, that kind of thing makes sense. And so one would have looked at this and one would have giggled at, oh, I see what's happening here. All right, the 2 wingmen are taking the chaperones away. Oh, I know what's about to happen with these 2 young folks. It's just, yeah, that's, and like I said, Pootie, all these Pootie, right? But again, you know, the little Pootie, they are equated with Cupid, the god of love, right? And so that's a big part of, and Venus as well, Venus, the goddess of love. That's why they're here,